Listen, what makes the Battle of Marengo interesting is that it takes Napoleon Bonaparte out of his element. Because across so many of his great battles and great campaigns, he's the guy that's attacking. He's the one on the offensive. Marengo's not like that. Marengo is a battle that's all about defense. And yet, within the tactical details of it, you can still understand why the man was such a genius, right? His ability to work the cavalry and the infantry and the artillery together, his knowing when and where to deploy his reserves, and it's a battle that's a little about luck, if I'm being honest. But if you're thinking, why should I care about Marengo? Why should I watch this video? It's because, as a whole, the battle is a Napoleonic masterclass in how to turn a defeat into a victory. Okay, but before I go any further, I just want to make a quick note about something here. The French enemy at the Battle of Marengo are the Habsburgs, or the Habsburg Empire. Now, throughout a lot of this video, I'm going to refer to Habsburg units and forces as Austrian, right? I'm going to say, for example, this Austrian unit went here, or the Austrians attacked there. Just know that I use these two terms interchangeably throughout the video, even though it's not technically correct. I mean, for one thing, Austria was just a single nation or state in the Habsburg army and empire, which had men from a lot of different places. So, for the purposes of clarity, just keep this in mind. I'm going to briefly sum up the strategic situation before the battle so that you can understand the tactical decisions that were made during it. So, it's the year 1800, and on our map here of northern Italy, you had these Habsburg forces everywhere threatening French control of the area. Now, Napoleon, who is our figure here, Napoleon doesn't like this, so he takes with him an army. They cross the Alps, right? They descend down the valleys of Italy, and they manage to successfully isolate a large contingent of the enemy. Now, Bonaparte here suspects that these guys are going to try and escape back home, right? They're going to try and go back to Austria somehow. So what he does is he breaks up his forces and he begins sending them along the routes he thinks they're going to take to go home. Unbeknownst to him, however, the Habsburg forces actually grew some balls and decided to try and fight their way out. Their plan for doing so called for the convergence of their forces at the city of Alessandria, where in the early hours of June the 14th, they made their move. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the fields of northern Italy. On the one side over there, you have the French forces in blue surrounding the village of Marengo. And here, close to us, next to Alessandria, are the Habsburg forces in yellow. Now, the first obstacle separating the two sides here is the large Boromida River, which Habsburg forces begin to cross on these bridges that they'd built and tethered the night before. Now, the whole idea behind them attacking early is to take advantage of the fact that the French have absolutely no idea that this big battle is about to take place. However, the element of surprise isn't the only advantage on their side, because the Habsburgs also have numerical superiority with almost 29,000 men total and 90 plus guns here. Versus the French, who as of this hour number only 15,000 men and just 16 guns. So let's talk about what the Habsburg plan is at this battle. How do they plan to maneuver the battlefield to win? Well, their plan is actually quite simple. It's a three-pronged offensive with attacks on key objectives in the south here and the north here, whilst a large thrust in the center helps keep the main French enemy body pinned down whilst the sides close in. By 8 a.m., the first Austrian forces have begun to make contact with French outposts. These units here are part of a 4,000-man division led by one Field Marshal Lieutenant Andreas O'Reilly, who's our man here. Now, O'Reilly's goal, rather than pursuing the first enemy forces he runs into, is to instead head right with instructions to capture La Stortiglione farm on the southern side of the battlefield. Now, this is a smart move that's going to help develop the Austrian right wing early, but it's a move that also gives French General Claude Victor Perrin, who's our guy in black here, he's our general in black, it gives him time to organize the defense of the center. Victor pulls back his men to the Fontanon River, which is our thin black line over here, and establishes a defensive line in front of it, right as General von Melas, Michael von Melas, who's our guy here, right as von Melas hurls 4 battalions down the middle. Back at the Boromida River over here, Commander Peter Ott, who's our third Austrian Habsburg general, Commander Peter Ott, along with 7,500 men, begin moving into position with instructions to capture the village of Castelceriolo in the north over there. By now, if the French had not been aware of how serious the situation was becoming, the danger was crystallized with the sound of heavy artillery. The first of these Austrian cannons to make it across begin firing right as von Melas sends in another division, which proves too much for the French forces in the center, and 6 exhausted battalions break and flee. Victor rushes to plug the opening by unleashing his 2nd division forward, whose arrival manages to stabilize the Fontanon River. To Victor's left, which is on our right over here, French General Joachim Murat has sent in Francois Kellerman. This is Francois Kellerman. He sent in Francois Kellerman's cavalry brigade to prevent an open flank from being exposed. And as the fighting continues, French General Louis-Alexandre Berthier arrives at the battle, and after taking a good look around, he quickly writes to Napoleon, who's a little further back, telling him that an entire battle is now developing and to come down immediately. By now, Berthier's message has reached Napoleon, who's on his way. In the meantime, French General Jean Lannes, who's this guy here, who's recognized the importance of maintaining a tight defensive line, has brought up his forces to shore up Victor's right, which is on our left over here. Singing the Marseillaise, men of the 6th Leger and 22nd Line launched attacks across the Fontanon stream that pushed back some of the units that had crossed it in the north, holding this position against counterattacks. Despite this, the situation remains critical for the French army. And you kind of have to ask yourself, how the hell does one manage to stabilize such a state of affairs? Well, for that, let's take a look at the battle from Napoleon's perspective. Riding in just before noon, Napoleon Bonaparte finally arrives to the battlefield. But he's arrived to an absolute mess of a fight, because in the center here, Victor's 2nd Division is being battered by artillery and its commander has fled the scene. On the left, over there, Kellerman's Heavy Cavalry Brigade, along with the 8th Dragoons, are so far managing to prevent the enemy forces from crossing the Fontanon and unleashing onto the left flank. But by far the most worrying development is in the north here, where Ott's attack on Castelceriolo has overwhelmed its defenders, and by 11:30 a.m. it's under his control. And this is a big problem because from this position, Ott has the freedom of movement to turn and attack the French flank. Outnumbered and outgunned, Napoleon has brought up with him only a single division, plus the consular guard. If there is any hope for the French, it lay approximately 5 miles from the battlefield, moving in the other direction. The division of one General Louis Desailles were amongst those sent out the previous day to try and intercept the supposedly fleeing Austrians. Seeing now that they weren't going anywhere, Napoleon writes to his old friend, telling him something along the lines of, "If you haven't gone too far, come back because the entire Austrian army is in fact here." During the past 2 hours, the Austrians have deployed 20 more cannons, which means they've got 40 cannons now firing into the open, causing tremendous damage to the French center and allowing the Habsburg infantry units to breach the Fontenone and begin the fight for the village of Marengo. At the same time, Peter Ott's vanguard forces are moving to threaten Lens right, whilst on the left over there, Kellerman's cavalry are carefully retiring squadron by squadron, preventing the flank from collapsing. However, 2 hours was also enough time for Bonaparte's message to reach Desailles and for Desailles' answer to come flying back. In his reply, Napoleon's old friend writes that he and his division can join the battle, but not until 5 p.m. Despite that being 4 hours away, Napoleon sees his chance at a comeback. The arrival of additional infantry and cannon could provide the strength needed to organize and launch a counterattack. But if Napoleon is going to play around this wind condition here, then he's going to have to conduct a defensive miracle for the next few hours. Because on all sides of the battlefield, he's losing ground, he's losing key objectives, and his army is running low on morale and ammunition. By 2 p.m., the Habsburgs have now deployed 80 cannons. They've also captured the village of Stortiglione in the south and Marengo in the center, allowing them to push back the forces of Law and Victor, who by 2:30 p.m. retreat together, moving to reform their lines at the village of Spinetta. However, the north still proves to be the biggest threat. Ott's forces here are moving in on Lannes' retreating men, and if Napoleon is to save his right flank from collapse, he must do something to protect it. So he orders the reserve division of Jean-Charles Monnier to move in right of Laon and face the forces of Peter Ott. Unfortunately for Napoleon, Monnier's division is quickly defeated, and they're forced to retire off the battle entirely. This creates a calamity that takes the battle to its climax. If Ott's forces continue to advance towards Lannes' retreating men, then the entire French army would get rolled and the battle would be lost. Again, Bonaparte must do something, and so he calls on 900 of the Consular Guard to take the field. Now, I made the Consular Guard in dark blue here, right, compared to the normal light blue, because the Guard are not your normal soldiers. You don't just throw them in. These guys here are the elite of the French army. Men that were not only bigger and taller than your average infantry soldier, but also better trained, better equipped, and throughout a lot of Napoleonic battles, the decision of when and where to use the Guard will make or break a fight. And it's at this moment of the battle, Napoleon decides that the situation is serious enough to warrant their deployment. Marching in column, the Guard are sent to hold the ground between two small hamlets right of Lannes' division, where immediately they are attacked by dragoons, and they're forced to deploy into a square. Here, for the next 40 minutes, they trade volleys with infantry units thrown at them, plus 3 more cavalry charges. With both sides unwilling to back down, the Habsburg commanders know that they must break this flank, and a bayonet charge finally proves too much for the Guard, who after taking severe losses, begin to retreat. Despite being utterly annihilated, the Guard's heroic sacrifice had bought the time needed for the rest of the French army to regroup and reform their ranks. In an incredible display of leadership and discipline, the entire French army began to retreat 1 battalion at a time, fighting as they moved for 3 kilometers back towards the village of San Giuliano. Following them is the Austrian center, which has by now formed into a massive pursuit column for the final push. But whether it was overconfidence or maybe it was a lack of communication, the rest of the Habsburg forces lost a bit of focus here. The Austrian right, which is on the left over there, has disengaged from the center to chase a 300-man detachment, whilst on the other side over here, a small brigade of French cavalry prevented Ott from joining as well. Nevertheless, they had more than enough men and confidence to deal the final blow versus an exhausted enemy that had been retreating since 8 in the morning. For his part, Napoleon was all out of reserves, had barely 6,000 fighting men, aided by only about 1,000 cavalry and only 6 guns. However, right as the Austrian attack arrived at San Giuliano, so too did the division of Louis Desailles. Rushing to greet them, Napoleon urges Desailles' men into position in front of San Giuliano, and with this boost in numbers, Bonaparte now has 11,000 men, 1,200 cavalry, plus 19 cannon for the long-awaited counterattack. And as the Habsburg infantry begin to advance for what they assume is the final push, their center is instead met by a wave of artillery, then ripped apart by canister fire. As luck would have it, a stray shot managed to strike an ammunition wagon, whose explosion sent a ripple of fear throughout the Habsburg line. Still, thousands of Austrian infantry and Hungarian grenadiers remained unfazed and got into line to unleash a volley of musket fire. But if they ever stood a chance, it was immediately extinguished by the incredible maneuver of Kellerman. You see, during this time, he had moved up over here. He'd come behind like this and moved up to the French right. And he'd concealed himself for the right moment, when thousands of Habsburg muskets had just been unloaded. Standing unprepared, these units here are caught completely by surprise as 400 heavy cavalry of the 2nd and 20th regiments charge into the flank, sending 4,000 Habsburg units fleeing and taking another 2,000 prisoner. But Kellerman's not done. He then turns around, gathers 200 more men who had been at the rear of the last charge, and attacks some 2,000 Austrian cavalry who had been standing idle, and he forces them to charge into their own line. All this proved too much for the Habsburg units, as a wave of panic spread through their lines, prompting a collapse of the entire center as thousands of units began to flee. As they did, the entire French army was ordered to advance, doing so across a battlefield that just a few hours ago saw them running the other way. Any Habsburg units that aren't killed or captured in this route are forced to recross the bridges of the Boromida, securing Napoleon his first great victory, preserving an army that was on the brink of annihilation, and maintaining Bonaparte's political aspirations back home as well. And that's the Battle of Marengo. Before you go, I have one more thing I want to show you. Yo, thank you so much for watching the video. Before you go, I've got this collection book thing that I made to help me keep track of key players and units in the battles that I talk about. Here, let me show you what I mean. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Maybe you guys can... So first, I've got a page all for Napoleon, right? And for the battles that he fought and his emblem, right? The bee emblem and the crown and all that. And for the Battle of Marengo, I've made a little sticker, right? You can see here, of Jacques-Louis David's painting of him crossing the Alps. Fun fact about that, and another example of Napoleonic luck, the weather was supposedly perfect during his crossing, right? But it was terrible right before and right after. So there is Napoleon for the Battle of Marengo. Whoops. Okay, there we go. Far from perfect, but that's Napoleon done. Okay, so Marengo also had 4 future marshals of the empire. I've got stickers for those men too. You have here, here's Murat, right? Here is Victor, this is Victor. And here's Berthier. And of course, my favorite, Jeanlin. Look at him. Fun fact about some of these guys, Murat's father was actually an innkeeper, and Victor's was a bailiff, which, if you contrast that with some of the guys these generals faced off against across the battlefields of Europe, these Russian princes and Austrian Vons, it's really cool to think about these humble-ass Frenchmen, you know, just smashing European nobility across the early 19th century. Where's Joachim Murat? Here's Murat. Marshal Murat. There we go. This one here is Berthier. There we go. Here's Jeanlin. And here's Claude Victor Perrin. There we go. And then last but not least, we have the Imperial Guard, who Napoleon called his fortress of granite for their performance at Marengo. Of course, they were the consular guard at that time, right? The Imperial Guard hadn't been formed yet. Anyway, here is their Marengo sticker, right? For their heroic performance. And that's it. If you could like and subscribe, as always, I do appreciate it a lot. Thank you so much for watching. And yeah, I'll see you on next video. Thank you.